So this is the beginning of a series of videos in which I'm going to go through the play of King Lear, looking at it as a tragedy in terms of paper 1 of the AQA A Level syllabus, looking at a sequence of sections from the play that might potentially appear as sections on the passage-based question. We're going to start at the very, very beginning of the play, which, although it's only 32 lines long, so perhaps slightly short for the AQA specification, is an interesting and simple beginning. What would we do with any section of the play? Well, we'd do this. We'd locate the passage first of all. We'd say, well, whereabouts does this appear within the play as a whole? What's just happened? What's about to happen? How does that affect what we understand in this sequence? We then want to try and define that narrative within the sequence. What are the key events here? What sort of structure do we have to this little sequence? There might be some climaxes or some changes. We'd look at classic things around the character development, the way themes are recurring, and there's a lot of strong and highly developed themes within this play. Language and structure we're always going to want to analyse. And in terms of the form of the play, we're going to look at it as a piece of drama on stage, so we might think about how the actors and directors might work with this particular sequence, and we may refer to versions we've watched before, for instance. And we're always going to try to link it to elements of tragedy without letting that become a checklist that just becomes a list of key terms without any real interest. The question that we will always address is the same question every year, and it's that one there. And it talks about exploring the significance of the extract in relation to the tragedy of the play as a whole. Significance does not simply mean importance here, but means meanings, ideas, feelings, what's conveyed, what's portrayed, what's put across, what are the intentions. So pretty much everything that's conveyed within the scene. And yes, it's linked to tragedy, and yes, to the play as a whole, but the exam board seemed to be quite clear that they want us to concentrate largely on a detailed analysis of what happens within this extract, using the play as a whole to help explain this extract, so that we might link forward to things that happen later or link back to explain what's happening here, but always with an eye on how that helps us understand what's in front of us. So our first sequence might be the very first sequence in the play, and it's the sequence in which Kent and Gloucester are talking before Lear enters. And this is perhaps surprising, sometimes forgotten, that this is how the play begins. We think of the first scene as being Lear's big grand entrance and his big performance about dividing the kingdom, but in fact the scene begins with a sort of quiet, rather whispered, almost gossipy little exchange between Kent and Gloucester. And we might wonder why Shakespeare chooses to start the play like this, and one reason may well be to undercut what happens next and to make Lear's performance seem weaker and more foolish in light of what we hear here. What we do here is Gloucester really defining his character for us more than anything else. We get Gloucester as this sort of rather bumbling, foolish, self-important, self-involved, rather irresponsible character, a rather flippant mood that he seems to take in this sequence, which is a bit surprising for a play that's full of stormy, violent action and terrible, terrible disputes and awful, grim violence, that here it begins with a sort of almost comic flippancy, as we'll see. Kent is actually the one who has the first words in the play, and he doesn't quite have the last words in the play, but he's there at the end. He's the one character who really stays through the play all the way. There's kind of a consistent image of his loyalty. He seems very humble again throughout this little sequence, and he's asking Gloucester to confirm something for him as if he can't even make any assertion for himself. But what he says is that he thinks that the king is more on the side of Albany than Cornwall, which establishes our protagonist and antagonist split in the play, that we're going to get two sets of characters here. The sort of good characters around Lear, Gloucester, Edgar and Kent, the fool with him. And then the bad characters, the evil, selfish, self-serving characters. Now Albany's on the good side, Cornwall's on the bad, along with Regan, Goneril and Edmund. What's also established here is that there's a bit of confusion, and that Kent, as we'll see, a very loyal follower of Lear, doesn't really understand what Lear's doing and is confused by Lear's decision making, and we'll see him in conflict with that very soon. And this again establishes key characteristics for King Lear, somebody who's about to make a foolish error. That word affected is not an accidental word, affected as in emotions, feelings, but also kind of suggesting about whim and, changing feelings, and how Lear really can't be predicted because he changes his mind based on his emotions rather than any sort of careful consideration of the facts. He's not very strategic. He's not actually a very good leader. Gloucester's reply, his first speech in the play, is long-winded in comparison to Kent's rather terse beginning, and again establishes that as a key characteristic of Gloucester. He's a bumbling fool, and he can't say anything directly. Everything's circumlocucious, loquacious, and the actor performing Gloucester must make a decision now. Are we to like Gloucester and side with him? And sometimes we seem to in the play. At other times we might think that he deserves rather what he gets because he behaves so selfishly and self-indulgently in a rather sort of casual way. Indeed, Edgar seems to suggest later in the play that Gloucester did get what he deserved. He lost his eyes because of his extramarital affair that gave birth to Edmund. And it's that's the subject of the conversation after that brief reference to Lear. Kent draws attention to Edmund and asks if this is his son, which suggests that Edmund must be standing somewhat back and can't be right by Gloucester's side, otherwise that would seem less of an obvious question to ask. So Edmund sort of emerges out of the shadows perhaps at this stage, rather devil-like. I don't know, that might be a way of doing it. When he's asked a very simple question, again Gloucester takes a rather long time to answer. Instead of talking directly and saying exactly the situation, he talks euphemistically, and he acknowledges though that he has blushed about him, but now he's brazen to the fact that he is his bastard, basically. And that again makes us perhaps suspicious of Gloucester, that he is irresponsible and isn't really owning up to his own failings and his own misdemeanours. Kent is given a sort of punning line. Does he know it's a pun? Is he setting one up for Gloucester there? Or it's a rather odd choice of mode for this beginning, to have this sort of punning humour. He says, I can't conceive you, meaning I can't understand you. And Gloucester picks up that word conceive and says, oh, his mum could, as in she conceived, she got pregnant. Again, euphemism, long-windedness, round-wombed, and you can't just say the word pregnant. And then rather, do you smell a fault? Something a little rather kind of, again, self-important there of Gloucester, sort of almost challenging Kent. Go on then, tell me I'm wrong. He is probably wrong, isn't he? It's not nice to have affairs behind your wife's back. But he doesn't want to acknowledge that. Instead, he wants to challenge Kent to either say that it's a fault, or hopefully what seems to be his intention rhetorically is to say, no, it's not a fault, you're absolutely fine. Kent's response is a little strange, that he seems to kind of be rather enamoured of Edmund and says, oh, he's so wonderful, he's so proper, he's so good looking and so handsome and so well put together that can't wish him undone. So it seems to establish Kent as a character who rather sort of in awe of the power and authority of the real leaders. He's very much a follower, and he's very attracted to those who have charisma. Again, the next speech, even longer. Gloucester seems to warm to his theme, and his speeches get longer by turn in this scene, until this one, again, is a long-winded way of saying, I have another son. And it's the only reference to Edgar in this scene, although Edgar, of course, as we can see from, if we go back to the PowerPoint, is in fact the second most important character in terms of speeches and lines in the play. After Lear, who has 749 speeches, Edgar has 392, more than anybody else, and again numbers of lines, although not much more than half of Lear's number of lines. They are more than any other single character. So that's often a bit of a challenge in this play to say, how can you make it Edgar's play when he is so central in terms of sheer stage time? And he is even referred to here in one of the scenes that he's not present. Kent, again, very impressed by Edmund. Edmund says very, very little. No, my lord. It's a negative. It's a word of refusal, which is polite in this situation, but perhaps is typical of Edmund as a refuser, as one who stands up against things. But yeah, Kent seems to be impressed by him, and they introduce Edmund to him, and he says, "I must love you and sue to know you better." And I don't think there's ever been a production in which Kent is portrayed as having homosexual desires for Edmund, and I don't think that's probably Shakespeare's intention there, but more that Edmund has a charisma and an appeal that makes someone like Kent want to follow him and want to be impressed by him. At this point, anyway, as we have said, Edmund is putting on an act, so it's questionable what exactly Edmund's doing here to make him seem respectable. His body language, for instance, might be very tight and controlled and rather formal, whereas a little bit looser and more wild later on in the play. Again, Sir, I shall study deserving. Edmund seems to be good at putting on an act, and lots of Shakespeare's characters are good at acting and performing different roles in front of different people, pretending to be one thing rather than another. Disguise and deception, of course, are a big theme in this play. The final lines in this opening 32 are Gloucester saying, well, he's been away for 9 years and I'm sending him off again. And this might be the hint at Edmund's justification, really, and his motivation for why he's quite so unpleasant and quite so evil. He's just angry that he's been dismissed from the court, he's been pushed aside, he's been pushed out of Gloucester's castle. Gloucester doesn't seem to want to know him. So, overall, what have we got in this opening sequence? We've got a rather kind of light, almost jocular approach from Gloucester in particular, which perhaps makes him seem less likeable, and that's something the director and actor has to decide upon. Do we want to like Gloucester as a lovable old fool, or do we want to dislike him as a self-deceiving old fool, a bumbling idiot who actually thinks he's not a bumbling idiot and thinks he's important, but he's not? It was very much a calm before the storm scene. The rest of this scene, we'll see Lear get into a massive clash with Cordelia and Kent and just generally be furious, and really for the rest of the play pretty much in that mode. We've heard the sense here that Lear is unpredictable, whimsical, following his emotions rather than planning things carefully. We've got a really good picture of Gloucester already, and something of Kent in his respect for authority. Edmund seems to be putting on an act. We don't really get to know him here, and again it seems hard to find a way to think how he could perform the scene in which he would actually appear to be clearly putting on an act without making it too arch. As a first-time reader or audience, you might well take Edmund at face value here, but you probably already have some strong, clear pictures of Kent and Gloucester in particular. We might wonder where they would be on stage, probably tucked off to one side, waiting for the central moment, so the stage will be cleared, ready for Lear's entrance. And so this is very much a prelude towards the main act, and of course the topic of the very beginning is Lear himself, who's not there, but soon will be. So what would we do with this if we were going to write about it for the exam? We would have located the passage very easily, but obviously we would pretty much be writing about how this establishes things that are going to happen later. We've got a very simple narrative of Kent being introduced to Edmund, and then Kent and Gloucester talking a little bit about Lear. Performance, well, we would be getting all the messages about what kind of version we're going to see here if we saw it on stage. What's the costumes like? Is it modernised costumes, as it often is these days, or something a bit more Elizabethan, which sometimes is chosen? This play is not really set in Elizabethan times, but in some very distant prehistory, so that we could go for that as a very kind of sort of old-fashioned, almost Roman or something like that type costumes, something from very much the prehistoric era. Elements of tragedy. How is this tragic? Well, it's the word division, isn't it? Tragedy is about divisions, and this play is going to operate around divisions. And those divisions have been hinted at, even in this very calm opening. Lear is going to divide the kingdom. The audience will be alert to that term and think, that's a mistake. Don't divide kingdoms up. Historically, King James had just gone to the throne when this play was written, and he was all about trying to unite the kingdom, bring Britain together, Scotland and England in particular as one, although he struggled to make that law. So division's a bad thing, and of course we've seen the potential for division between Edmund and Edgar too, although that's only hinted at. Even as a first-time reader or watcher, you might think, I wonder how Edmund feels about being sent away. I wonder how Edgar feels about Edmund being taken to be as his equal, but he isn't treated as his equal. So, there's hints there, isn't there, that there are going to be problems, family breakup, etc. We're not really sure who Albany and Cornwall are at this moment. There's no reference to Lear's daughters, interestingly enough, in the opening scene, or the opening of the opening scene. So we've got lots to play with, even in this very small section, and in fact that's the case with this play, that every section has a rich references to lots of other things that could be connected to it elsewhere in the play. But what we've got is a sense of anticipation more than anything, and that would probably be a driver for your essay here. How does this make us anticipate what's going to happen next, expect certain things, hope for certain things, and be aware that with it being a tragedy, that this is likely to be sowing the seeds of future further division. So division and anticipation would be your beginning of your response to this. So hopefully that's given you a few ideas on a very simple section. When we get into some of the other sections, there will be more to say. Thank you for listening.